I wanted to thank, first of all, the publisher, de Découverte. I wanted to thank Eric Vassin for shepherding this project of translation. I wanted to thank Sylvie Blumenkrantz for making all of the travel arrangements, and I think probably a lot of other arrangements here as well. I wanted to thank the Institut Emilie du Châtelet for being the host for this event. I'm very honored to speak in the name of an institute that honors the name of an important woman scientist from so many centuries ago. What I'd like to do in today's talk is give you briefly an overview of what is in the book, and then use one example in particular to show you a little bit about the method that the book uses. And because the method that I use takes a look at the notion of how we can construct facts about science that are at the same time constructed but also based on the body, based on reality. So I want to show you, put another way, I'm asking the question, how does culture become part of our science? So the general topic that I will deal with today is constructing the hormone-behavior connection. But I'll start first with, yes. So I'm speaking about the book first published under the title Sexing the Body. And the small print is Gender Politics and the Construction of Sexuality. And then the translation, which called it in two genres, and then the duality of the sexes and science. I won't try and read the French. So this is the book that I'll be giving you an overview of first. And I think the book presents two big ideas. The first of these ideas is that scientific facts about the body are created through a process that weaves together both cultural and biological raw material. And the second big idea is that we cannot understand behavior by partitioning the cultural from the biological. Rather, we must always hold them together in the same circle. Another way that we can think about this is to say that our explanations are always 100% biological and 100% cultural. So the chapter topics, the book takes the method of giving several examples, showing how this works in several different examples. The first three chapters discuss the topic of intersexuality and the construction of sexual dimorphism, and the construction of the notion that there are absolute differences between male and female. And I will not primarily talk about that today during the talk, although I think it might come up during the conversation afterwards. Then I have a single chapter called that's about constructing brain sex, and I point out with many a gesture to Bruno Latour, because in this chapter in particular, I look at claims that there are differences between a structure in the brain called the corpus callosum, differences between men and women, and I use methods from science and technology studies that were really pioneered by Latour and other of his colleagues, as well as others in England and the United States, to dissect in a kind of micro way the literature that leads to and supports the notion that there are differences in this brain structure. Then, and this is what I'll talk about in more depth today, there are two chapters on the history of what I say are the so-called sex hormones, because in fact I argue that I show the history of how they've come to be called the sex hormones, and I argue in these chapters that that really is a misnomer, that in fact they should be thought of as powerful growth hormones which exist in both men and in women and can have similar effects and also different effects in the two sexes, and that to refer to them only in terms of reproduction and as being male hormones or female hormones was never correct. It never fit the data, even in the 1920s when scientists were struggling to understand them, and it's still wrong today. So we need to be thinking of them as growth hormones, not sex hormones. And then I guess what I will be telling you about more today is what I call the rodent's tale, which I say is a Chaucerian gesture, because in fact that's how I came by the name, from the chapters in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in which each member of the group has a different story to tell. So this is a story that rodents, primarily rats, tell, and that's what I will talk about today. And then lastly, I close in the book by talking about ways of thinking about how nature and nurture are intertwined, are interlaced, and how they cannot be separated. And that I will talk more about. I think I'll expand on that because I've done a lot more work on that since this book was first written. At the talk at Paris 8, I will discuss a lot more on that topic. So, I want to begin with an American scientist who named Frank Beach. He studied rodents. He was a behavioral biologist at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And he studied sexuality in rodents starting in the 1930s and was very active through into the 1950s and 1960s. And he died, I can't remember, but late 60s or sometime in the 1970s. And Frank Beach argued that the rodent was essentially bisexual, that the rodent brain started out in a bisexual fashion. Well, died in the 1980s, apparently. I answered my own question. He developed his most important ideas about animal sexuality just before and during World War II. And it's no accident, I think, and this is where one begins to ask about where the conjuncture of ideas come from. It's no accident that he hung around with Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey, who's the famed American sex researcher, and he went to some of Kinsey's so-called sex shows, and he talked to him extensively about sexual diversity. So there was an intellectual interplay between Kinsey and Beach, and I document this at greater length in the book. But Beach focused not on human behavior, but on animal behavior, and of course this communication of ideas went in both directions. It informed Kinsey's thinking about human behavior, but Kinsey's thinking also informed Beach's thinking about animal behavior. So Beach had a vision of animal behavior that, first of all, emphasized diversity. He did not think there was one correct animal behavior, one normal behavior, but he argued that there were many different forms of animal, and I'm speaking specifically of sexual behavior, and that both in male rodents and in female rodents, and in other animals as well, that there was a diversity of behaviors, and that these behaviors, what was interesting to him as an animal behaviorist, was to understand not only the physiology underlying those behaviors, but also what the social context was that permitted or stimulated one behavior rather than another behavior. He did not think if there were diverse behaviors, he didn't think that there were separate kinds of male rats, a gay male rat and a straight male rat, but rather that there could be behaviors that any rat might exhibit under certain circumstances. So the diversity was both individuals within each sex, and then also diversity between species. So he was also very aware that you couldn't study rats or even rats and guinea pigs, or maybe rats and mice and guinea pigs, and then know everything there was to know about the biology of sexuality. Because in fact, there's a huge difference, huge variability between species with regard to sexual behaviors. The second thing that both attracted me to Beach and I think made him an extremely interesting mid-century scientist was that he took a systems approach to analyzing behavior. He was interested in animals in a real context. In this regard, I think it's an older, one of the stories, it's a footnote in one of his papers that always amused me, because nowadays, if you're a scientist working with rats or mice, you try to get a genetically pure trait, and you breed mice and you interbreed them, and you keep working to get a stable strain that only does the one thing you want it to do. But Beach had a big colony of rats that he grew in the basement of the Museum of Natural History, and sometimes the colony would get weak or wouldn't be behaving, it would die out, and he would trap wild rats live from the basement of the museum and add them into his colony. So this is a very different kind of biologist than you would have today, where in fact my colleagues in biology today refer to the flies that they use or the animals that they use as reagents. They don't even refer to them as organisms. They are like a chemical sitting on a shelf that they add to their experiment. Very different way of doing biology. So he was interested, both the systems he was interested in were both the interactions between various physiological systems within the body. So how do the different parts of the body interact with one another? Hormones, the brain. But also, as importantly, he was interested in the social context of behavior. He was also an outspoken liberal on the topic of human sexual diversity. He did not think that sexual diversity was bad or evil or immoral or a sin. He was quite open to diversity of behaviors in humans as well as in his rats. And for somebody who was writing about this kind of thing in the 1940s and 1950s, this is actually pretty remarkable. So what were some of the things he found? One of the things he believed he had provided evidence for is that the motor patterns, that is the patterns of how nerves connected to muscles, that were then used in adults for mating, that those patterns, the neuromuscular connections for mating, were fully formed at birth. And he also found that male and female patterns were present in both sexes. So the typical patterns for male mounting, for what we think of as male mounting, those motor patterns were also available in females. And the pattern for lordosis, which is the technical term for that arching of the back, I think I have a photo of it in a minute, that the female rat does when stroked and approached by the male rat, that capacity for lordosis, just the motoric neuromuscular capacity, was present in male rats. So which one was expressed then, he believed, depended on the individual differences, both individual difference, developmental difference, and the couple combinations. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. Though one of the things that involved, that was important in couple combinations was whether one or both of the rats had previous experience. So later on, when scientists were disagreeing with Beach and trying to prove an absolute difference between male and female behaviors except for hormones, they used only very experienced males. And if they had a male in their group that wasn't interested in mating, for example, and there were always males that were like, I don't care, They took that male out of the story. So they wouldn't use that male. It didn't count. It didn't enter in the data as a mate. It just wasn't there at all. So they selected for experienced males who were very active maters in order to get the data that they wanted. And Beach disagreed with that as a method. It was a methodological difference because it's a difference that suppressed knowledge of diverse behaviors. And then expression of particular sexual behaviors depends on multiple stimuli via all of the senses. So he was concerned with visual sense, touch, and also smell as being all critical components of the stimulation of a sexual response. And he argued that hormones are, as I've already explained, are sexually non-specific. And it depended on context. So this is the kind of diagram that he drew. And this is what he called the relationships between the central excitatory mechanism and what he called the integrative circuits responsible for motor patterns. So this is a bunch of nerves in the central nervous system. And he had all sorts of things going on. These were various receptors for hormones and for other stimuli. And he had androgens, the so-called male hormones, might increase excitability. It might lower thresholds for circuits for a male pattern. There might be also neural circuits for a female pattern. So both of these were present. They both had primary connections with the sensory systems. And then the questions were, how did the hormones, the so-called male hormones, the androgens, and the so-called female hormones, the estrogens, how did they balance one another to either increase excitability in a part of the brain or decrease it, and therefore eventually to generate the two behaviors that were most studied, which was either the mounting behavior or the lordosis behavior. So he had a system like this in which all things were present, and it was the balance present in both males and females, and it was a balance of hormones, prior experience, context, and development, prior development that mattered. So what he wrote was, the physiological mechanisms for feminine sexual behavior are found in all males, and for those for masculine behavior exist in all females. Human homosexuality, he wrote, reflects the essentially bisexual character of our mammalian inheritance. And he wrote that in a series of lectures, the Harvey lectures that he gave in 1948. So these were ideas that were, and he was at the top of the field at this time. But then something curious happened. His theories in the 1950s failed to take hold. Although they were very prominent in the 1940s, by the end of the 1950s, they were no longer considered to be correct. And the question is why? How did that happen? And if it were up to me, I would rehabilitate his theories. You'd have to modernize them. But the question is, how did another point of view take hold, and why has it remained, I would say, with a death grip on the field? So what happened in the 1950s, starting in the late 1950s, was a different big idea overwhelmed all challenges. And it still reigns today. And it resists all critique. And for me, one of the interesting questions is, how does it resist critique? So this idea that took over is something called the organizational activational theory of hormones and behavior. And briefly, the experiments that were done in many varieties was to take an animal, either before birth or at birth, to remove its native gonad, so remove either its testis or its ovary, and then inject a hormone that you're testing, either prenatally or perinatally. The idea was that that injection then permanently organized the central nervous system. Well, in this example, the gonadectomy is later. There is this black box period in this story of development between birth and puberty, in which nothing of importance to sexual behavior is understood to happen. And then at puberty, the animal, now without its native gonad, but presumably only with its organized brain that was organized by this injection back here, is given a new hormone and tested behaviorally. And the idea is that the new hormone injection activates behaviors latent in brain organization. And it was this idea, this organizational activational theory, that was published first in a paper that's still quoted actively today. The first author was a man named Phoenix, and it was published in 1959. Became the way in which all authors thereafter designed studies. And they did these studies. They organized the testing of the behaviors. They organized the testing of the behaviors in very limited test conditions, in which they put one female in a cage with one male that had been previously tested as being a very sexually aggressive male. As I said, they took out the ones that weren't. But they also built on an earlier idea developed by the French researcher Alfred Jost, who wrote about the development of the gonadal system in animals. And he had several things to say. He had studied the actual gonads themselves, not behaviors, but they analogized from his conclusions. And his conclusions included the following points of view. He said, in 1969, he wrote, "Becoming a male is a prolonged, uneasy, and risky adventure. It is a kind of struggle against an inherent trend towards femaleness." And this was presented in different words, by American researchers, but saying in the presence of a Y chromosome, the gonad forms as testes. In the absence of testes, female genitalia develop. Sex determination can thus be equated with the determination of testis formation. That is no longer an idea that mouse biologists think is correct, but it's taken a long time to get that default idea, which stems from Jost, and if you think a little bit harder, it also stems from Freud, that the idea of a presence making a male, an absence making a female, and the analogy with the hormones and behavior was the presence of testosterone induced masculine behaviors in the male rats, and you could use it to induce masculine behaviors in the female rats if you did one of these complicated experiments. But that in the absence of testosterone, not in the presence of estrogen, they were not constructed as equal hormones. That in the absence of testosterone, you got female behaviors. So there were critics of this framework through the 1960s and 1970s, and they tended to be students of Frank Veitch's, actually, not surprisingly. I had an artist do this for me for the book, but they said things like, when they did these experiments, there was no mate choice. That is, the females were not offered 3 or 4 males with whom to mate. They were put in a cage with one very sexually aggressive male, period. So the critics of the study said, well, what happens if you offer mate choice? That was one thing. The second was that the idea that the female rats had sexual behaviors was not examined. But in fact, so that's the gift, we have a sex life too. So the idea was that if you look carefully, females, if they weren't forced to mate in that extreme situation, had their own role to play in the mating process, and they had a whole series of behaviors. They wiggled their ears, and they moved their whiskers, and they presented, and they ran away, and they sniffed, and there was some mutual decision-making, shall we say, if there was a context and more open context involved. And then the liberation now, I just threw that in. But actually, one of the scientific articles that was published by one of Beach's students was called a cry for the liberation of the female rat. And that was published in the mid-70s. Again, there's a cultural parallel with women's liberation at that moment. So the language that got used in the attempts to say there's a different story that needs to be told was used. But again, it didn't. In the end, it didn't succeed in undoing this other paradigm. So, what are some of the problems with this other paradigm? First of all, in most publications, and this is true for an awful lot of studies on sex differences in humans as well, still happens today. I love, someone sends me a headline from a newspaper saying, males and females have different, and you can fill in the blank. And then it'll say, in a study published last week I'll go to the original study, I'll look at the methods, and there were only males in the study. Or sometimes, more rarely, only females, but usually only males. That still happens. It's a methodological problem when you're talking about difference. And that was, shall I say. So there was no attempt, as that cartoon interest stated, to study female interest. So the whole, and this is where I say that the cultural and the scientific were together. In these scientific studies, there was an underlying and unquestioned cultural assumption that the females didn't actually play a role in whether a couple mated. So there was no attempt to study female interest in the mating process. There was no time or space for courtship behaviors. So these were studies done in a small cage. You get very different results if you do studies in a naturalistic setting. For one thing, animals have a place to hide. So if you think about, I don't know, animals living in the basement of the Museum of Natural History, they have more than one nest, and they have different hiding places, and they can come out and meet if they want to. They can retreat. They have different ways of interacting. It would be possible to do more realistic studies, but the studies that were done in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even today are not done with even an attempt to simulate a naturalistic setting. And the fact is that hormones have different effects depending on the context of the study. So there was no mate choice. I've already mentioned this. I've also mentioned this. They eliminated disinterested males from the study. And there was no place to hide. Again, the non-naturalistic testing arenas. So these were all critiques that were made of this work, all of which, to me, appear to be quite powerful, quite strong enough to require a reconsideration, a retesting, a redesign of experiments to test these ideas. And yet, the ideas have not been seriously retested. And the idea of organization and activation, even though there's exception after exception after exception found, still they are the ideas that are clung to. So the question is why? Well, one other point. There also in this time period in the 1970s, it was pointed out that the main model that was being used was a linear model in which at one end you had femininity and at the other end you had masculinity, and you could not have a masculine rat that was also feminine with this model. So another model that was proposed and which still has some point in the literature and some recognition in the literature was called an orthogonal model. And in this case, you had masculinity and femininity at right angles to each other. And so here you have a rat that is both low on the masculine scale and low on the feminine scale. And here you have one that's both highly masculine and highly feminine. The idea that these two kinds of beings could exist at the same time or in varying degrees, and obviously you can have an animal anywhere in between in this complex. So this is another point of view that was brought to the fore and that is too often, even today, neglected. So, why? Why is it so hard to change? And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because this was just an idea I was trying to figure out at the time. The art of macrame was very much in the current. I don't know, but at any rate, it seemed to me a way of asking, talking about where there were little knots in a weaving that maybe held something together to prevented it from unraveling, and then I wanted to discuss how having more and more knotted areas made something more and more difficult to unravel. So I think today we use a network analysis. There's nice little computer programs now to make network diagrams. That's, if I were writing this book today, that's probably what I would have done. But so let's start here. This is the idea of gender difference here. So that's a big central knot. And there are many things that got tied into it from many different fields, from many different academic disciplines, that then keep this knot, oops, wait, what happened? There we are. Keep this knot together. Take you to a few places. For example, over here is homosexuality. And you see that homosexuality is often presented as tied to difference, tied to gender difference. And so while you had homosexuality tied to gender difference, they also sustain one another by being tied together. You can't unravel the one because the other keeps it tied up. Up here, you have ideas that became very strongly held by psychologists, at least in the United States. The idea that, and it was related back to this notion of hormones. So to begin with, you say, well, there are these, the brains are organized differently prenatally by hormones, and then you have homosexuals who then presumably their brains were inappropriately organized prenatally, so that they had the brain of the wrong gender, or that they were somewhat feminized or somewhat masculinized. But then came the idea that hormones also had an effect in the same prenatal organizational period with sex differences in cognition. So you have some studies that show that girls developed vocabulary at younger ages and had better verbal skills than boys. These are mostly U.S. and also Great Britain. That boys had greater spatial skills, and this was understood then to be related to boys supposedly being better at mathematics, which would explain why more boys became scientists. And all of these ideas presumably then got linked to the idea that there was this prenatal organizational event of hormones. So it was that idea from rats now being translated actually into how we design our education system. There remain debates in the United States today about whether we should have separate classrooms for boys and girls because their brains are so different that they probably learn differently. And that the classrooms that serve girls are a disservice to boys and vice versa. So you have this idea taking hold. And then you have all of the ideas about where in the brain, I don't think I added in any more circles. No. Oh, I did. So you have brain effects of the prenatal hormones here. This is the idea that I say, why couldn't that change? Well, why did this become so difficult to change? That's because it's now part of this huge network of other ideas. Other things, other parts of the brain are involved. Suppose sex differences in aggression are involved, also attributed to this prenatal hormones. You have see, these are all things having to do with brain structure. Supposedly handedness might be, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, might have something to do with these prenatal hormones. So when an idea, like the organizational activational, this is my argument, when an idea like the organizational activational theory takes hold and begins to infiltrate into multiple disciplines and has a utility, an explanatory utility now in 5, 6, 7, maybe as many as 10 different disciplines related to psychology and biology, it becomes extremely difficult to dislodge the idea, even if the people who originally made the idea don't think it's right anymore. And certainly there are some biologists, some hormone biologists today who think, well, it may be somewhat right, but it surely should be modified. It's got a lot of extra things to add into it, a lot of caveats. But even so, even if the original biologist said, you know what, I was wrong, he wouldn't be able to change it at this point because it is doing so much service, so much work, so much social work, political work, intellectual work in so many different fields that it becomes extremely hard to change. And that is one of the main arguments that I make in the book, that when an idea about something fundamental like sex and gender, like biology of it, begins to do this kind of work cross-disciplinarily, it becomes very strong. So we can talk more about that later. So how else could we look at behavioral development in rodents? If we were to look at this differently, but still include biology, but include it in a more holistic fashion. We have, first of all, we have different levels of organization. We have the neural components that include the brain and the central nervous system. These, I should have more arrows here now. I would if I were doing this drawing today. But the brain and the central nervous system are affected by both sensory input and motor input. So the brain is very plastic. It continues to develop throughout life. And it is taking in information from the outside. So experience itself is changing the structure of the central nervous system. At all stages of development, you have hormones affecting nervous development. And you have hormones in the maternal fetal area, the perinatal, juvenile, pubertal, and adult. And these interact with living conditions, social rearing, and adult behaviors. And some of these are the kinds of living conditions when we're talking about rats. Are they dispersed or in territories? Are they in lab cages? Are they isolated? What are their stress levels? How large are their cages? What kind of physical stimulation have they had? There's a more recent study done by a woman who looked at the effects of estrogen on organizing the brain in animals that were given a very stimulatory environment versus one which was sensorially deprived. So grow up just in a cage, unable to move, or given a big area to play. The effects of hormones are very different depending on the environment. The social rearing, were these animals reared in all male groups? Not what happened in the wild. In the wild, they'd be reared in a mixed litter with male and female siblings. Were they reared in all female groups? Were they the same age? Were they reared with their mother? Were they multi-generational? All of these questions. What happened to them during the juvenile period? Usually a black box in these studies. And then what are the adult behaviors? Were they familiar with the test site? Did they have choices? How long was the test for? How often were they tested? Were they observed in wild or semi-wild conditions? And then you'll notice that I haven't mentioned genes yet. And that's because I think genes come at the end, not at the beginning. And so here I have down here gene expression. So gene expression affects all of these things, but it's also affected by the species and strain genotype. And it's a two-way direction. So what's important is which genes are expressed at what point, and which genes are expressed and when in development depends on all of these things: the sensory input, the context input, all throughout development. So genes do have a role to play, but they are not at the bottom of the pyramid. They are not a basal thing that happens, but rather I sometimes talk about them in terms of being the Oreo cookie, the American cookie, the Oreo. So I sometimes talk about genes as being what's in the middle, rather than being on one side or the other. So this is the kind of approach I've been trying to take to reconceptualize how we think about the brain, behavior, and the body in the time since I completed writing this book. And then finally, just to give us a notion, if we think of the Möbius strip and these ants as crawling along it, as being, and if we think of one surface, say this surface as being outside the body and this surface as being inside the body, then if you follow these ants along the strip, you'll discover that they may start outside and they end up inside. So, and I think this is how a better metaphor or a better way of imaging how we think about behavior, the brain, experience, and the body, as that the body is not a limit with some things outside and some inside, but rather that there's I used to have it animated, it was easier to follow, but that the body itself is in constant exchange with and is always responding to, as well as receiving the environment. I think that is the end. Yes, it is. So, thank you.
Vous avez su expliquer en peu de temps cette histoire invraisemblable, effectivement, de comment déconstruire une vérité scientifique aujourd'hui dans un contexte où tout est comme ça. L'histoire du macramé m'a bien plu, bien plus que le réseau d'ailleurs. Donc j'ai la tâche, moi, de parler de l'os, et dont il n'était pas question dans le livre qui est publié aujourd'hui en français, mais en revanche, vous avez dans d'autres articles parler des squelettes, des ossements. Et donc, ma première question, qui doit être, je vous adresse, concerne les os. Et donc, en tant que paléanthropologue, je me suis amusée à... Enfin, d'abord, j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur des populations villageoises de squelettes, donc un cimetière ancien, de 7000 ans jusqu'à il y a 2000 ans. Et ce que j'observe à l'intérieur d'un village, c'est pas deux catégories, jamais je ne vois ça. Ce que je vois tout le temps, c'est une énorme variabilité qui est immense. Enfin, à l'intérieur d'un village, il y a 3000 ans, 4000 ans, où les gens n'avaient pas des avions, hein, c'était donc des gens apparentés. Et le produit, c'est quand même une immense variabilité. Donc voici ces données-là. Et donc très vite, enfin au moins en France, très vite, enfin, moi j'ai travaillé à partir des années 80, assez vers les années 90, en gros, soit il y a des gens comme moi qui refusent d'estimer le sexe à partir des squelettes, ou bien on va essayer d'élaborer des théories par rapport à ça, explicatives, pourquoi on ne peut pas, ou pourquoi dans des cas très rares on peut. Et puis en France, je vois la majorité des anthropologues biologistes se défient. Ils sortent au moment où on leur pose la question quel est le sexe de ce squelette, quel est son âge. Là, tout le monde fuit. Alors je me suis amusée à voir PubMed, enfin, c'est un moteur de recherche online, et ce que j'ai vu m'a complètement surprise. C'est alors qu'il y a, jusqu'aux années 70, environ une publication par mois concernant l'estimation du sexe par les os. On va en avoir à partir des années 90 2 par mois. Et puis à partir de 2005, on arrive à 5 par mois. Et maintenant, on en est à 8 par mois. Dans la littérature anglophone scientifique aujourd'hui, sort par mois 8 publications où on a un nouveau critère pour estimer, pour estimer le sexe de l'individu. J'ai été surprise par ces statistiques, étant donné d'ailleurs que les auteurs précisent bien qu'ils ont un taux de réussite formidable sur la population qu'ils étudient, soit 80% de réussite, 95 pardon, mais que s'ils appliquent ces critères à la population d'à côté, le nord de la France, le sud de la France, ou la Corse et je ne sais pas Marseille, eh bien les critères ne fonctionnent plus. Alors au lieu de s'arrêter, on va estimer le sexe en se disant c'est un artefact, ce qu'on voit c'est un artefact, il continue et donc ces recherches ont d'argent pour fonctionner comme ça. Donc je suis très étonnée, je vous pose cette question, Anne, comme première question. Donc si vous avez une idée de ce phénomène scientifique extraordinaire où on est tout le temps à la recherche d'une estimation du sexe du squelette. C'est ma première question. Et comme je sais malheureusement qu'on va devoir poser toutes nos questions ensemble et que vous allez devoir répondre à toutes les questions ensemble, je pose un deuxième et qui concerne cette fois-ci un domaine un peu différent. On sait bien qu'aux États-Unis, les publications faites en France sont peu visibles et scientifiques, je veux dire publications scientifiques, il se trouve pourtant que par rapport aux publications féministes, un domaine a été très bien connu aux États-Unis, c'est ce qu'on a appelé le French féminisme, qui repose sur l'essentialisme, sur la naturalisation des sexes, alors qu'en France, les 3/4 des gens travaillaient alors en pensant que non, il n'y avait pas d'essentialisme là. Comment se fait-il qu'aux États-Unis, un seul courant de pensée, qui n'était pas majoritaire en France, en particulier parmi les scientifiques, soit le seul qui est passé l'Atlantique? Voilà, c'était mes deux questions, Anne, que je voulais vous adresser. Et je passe la parole à Joël Vienne, qui va vous poser cette question.
Est-ce qu'en fait, ça vaut le coup de corriger et de dire qu'on vous laisse répondre? Est-ce que vous préférez répondre après chaque intervention?
I think so,
okay.
yeah.
Donc, ne tenez aucun compte de ce que j'ai dit jusqu'à présent.
Okay. So thank you. There we go. That's better. So the question about bones is really interesting, and I have written a couple of papers on this topic. And one of the things that I discovered when I was researching the idea that women have different bone structures than men is that this idea gained huge strength with the financial support of the pharmaceutical companies that sold medicines that were supposed to help prevent osteoporosis in older women. So, and it was something, again, it's a beautiful science and technology studies story because the main company involved, Merck, which both sold hormones, female hormones that were used to, quote, treat osteoporosis, began to develop, actually they bought a small factory that was making a machine called a densitometer, and they developed a way to apply it to measuring bone density and to make the machines inexpensively available at screening centers throughout the country, and then began to promote the idea to doctors that women over a certain age, some said 50, some said 55, were in danger of getting osteoporosis. Osteoporosis was then defined as a statistic that was measured using this machine. So if you were below one standard deviation below what they said the normal population was, then you were at risk. You had something called osteopenia, which was bone loss. If you were 2 standard deviations in your spine or in your hip, then you were said to have osteoporosis, and it was recommended that you start receiving pharmaceutical treatment. So this was a closed circle. Furthermore, the machines contained within them a pre-designated test population that was usually, the first test populations were a population of white U.S. 20-year-olds. So young women were the test population against which the older women's standard deviation was compared. And so osteoporosis rapidly became an epidemic. But it turned out that these machines not only didn't work on different populations, but they also didn't work from one machine to the next. So if you changed radiologists and they had a different machine, you no longer had a baseline. You couldn't compare yourself to where you were 3 or 4 years ago. You had to start with a new baseline because the machines were inconsistent. So that provided an inexpensive method for doing studies, for doing research studies, and I think that then began to promote this sort of a research factory that also enabled medical researchers to then study new drugs to see if they might be better at preventing osteoporosis. Problems arose with the hormones being dangerous for the heart, so those had to stop being used. So it became a kind of self-generating research machine, medical machine, in which people were constantly searching for new ways to produce a difference. Now, with regard to French feminism, this is a little bit more difficult for me to answer because being a biologist more than a psychoanalyst, I will say that that the French feminists became popular in the United States. I think it was very much a disciplinary. That is, the feminism that became theoretical, produced theoretical feminism, came primarily from the disciplines of literature, the languages, and philosophy. And these feminists were very interested in new psychoanalytic theory. So they were interested in Lacan. They were interested in the students of Lacan who wrote about the body. And they started off with de Beauvoir, but they actually rapidly, except for one writer, left her behind. And it was a way of trying to understand how difference was produced. I don't think they believe that that the theory, at least in their hands, was deterministic. So Eveline, I think American feminists didn't consider their use of French feminism to be determinist, but rather a way of understanding how certain widespread behaviors might come into existence through a psychoanalytic process. But I think that also that moment in the U.S. is gone. That is, I now think that there's a renewed interest in trying to understand mind-body interactions. There's a renewed interest in the kind of work that I'm doing, where you begin to not reject biology as being a danger to equality, but rather understand how biology is part of how any of us come into being. So I think that moment has changed. But I do think that it partly was a phenomenon of belonging to a particular discipline. So they were people who were either studied the English language literature or Francophone literature, and were extremely interested in the French intellectual movements at the time.
Okay.
Merci, Anne.
Merci. Bien, moi, en tant que... Ça marche? Oui, ça marche. Ça marchote pour les... Ça marche? Ça va? Ou c'est trop fort? Non, c'est pas très fort. Bon, d'accord, je vais rapprocher alors. Oui, donc moi, je voulais aussi vous remercier pour ce magnifique exposé. Je voulais aussi dire que j'étais très contente que votre livre soit traduit, et que c'est vrai que pour moi, je pense comme pour Evelyne et Catherine, depuis toutes ces années, ça nous a à la fois, je dirais pas influencé, mais moi, à chaque fois que je lisais vos articles et tous vos écrits, j'étais très contente de voir que d'être féministe et scientifique, que ce soit d'un côté ou l'autre de l'Atlantique, aboutissait finalement à peu près aux mêmes conclusions, et qu'on avait le même regard sur la science et sur son objectivité prétendue. Voilà, donc indépendamment de ça, je voulais aussi, donc moi je voudrais vous poser une question qui a plus à voir avec les gènes, comme dirait Eric, les gènes sont au milieu. Moi, comme je suis biologiste cellulaire et généticienne, j'ai tendance à penser que les gènes sont à l'origine de tout, mais bon, peut-être que je me trompe un peu, peut-être qu'il faut que je revoie ma position. Et donc, bon, je sais pour vous avoir lu déjà, et encore cette fois en français, ce qui est encore plus agréable, que vous avez beaucoup travaillé avec des organisations d'intersexes. Moi, je pense que un des éléments qui a beaucoup fait avancer la pensée, c'est justement la mise en évidence de la part de la science, même si la science n'a pas pris, en tout cas pas très rapidement, la mesure de ce qu'il découvrait, c'était de montrer qu'effectivement, il existait des individus qui n'avaient pas ce que moi j'ai tendance à appeler un morphotype classique, que beaucoup de médecins ou scientifiques ont tendance à appeler anormaux, et qui ne sont pas classables dans la catégorie homme ou dans la catégorie femme telle qu'elle est fermée et exclusive l'une de l'autre. Donc je sais qu'il y a beaucoup de formules de cariotypes, de formules chromosomiques qui sont hors normes, qui ne sont pas 46 chromosomes dont un X et un Y ou 2X pour les femelles, mais qu'il y a beaucoup de cariotypes hors normes. Et je pense que au fil des années, le travail fait par ces associations a permis effectivement de remettre en cause un certain nombre de pratiques qui étaient quand même, moi j'ai tendance à qualifier de barbares. J'espère qu'il n'y a pas trop de médecins dans la salle qui au fil des années, les choses se sont beaucoup modifiées. J'aurais tendance à dire qu'on a moins essayé de reclasser les gens dans la catégorie mâle ou la catégorie femelle. Et je voulais vous demander, donc là, grâce à un ami à nous qui s'appelle Vincent Guillot, qui est dans une association intersexes, on a appris qu'il y a 15 jours peut-être, il y a eu en Suisse une prise de position du comité d'éthique sur l'intersexualité et sur le comportement des médecins et plus généralement de l'administration à avoir par rapport à ces personnes qu'on appelait intersexes, maintenant dont on dit qu'ils ont une variabilité variation du développement sexuel. Comment ça se passe? Je sais que vous avez beaucoup travaillé avec des associations intersexes aux États-Unis, donc où est-ce qu'on en est maintenant aux États-Unis? Est-ce qu'il y a des recommandations? Est-ce qu'il y a des pratiques médicales qui ont évolué, disons, dans les 20 dernières années? Comment est-ce que ça se passe? Et est-ce que on a un recul suffisant pour savoir ce qu'il en est précisément? Voilà, merci.
Thank you for that question. First, I would explain that, as you probably know, the medical system in the U.S. is extremely chaotic. So it is virtually impossible to make a general statement because medical practice in a large university advanced research center is very different from medical practice in a rural area. It will be different in the north than in the south, and so forth. So a couple of things. One is that the intersex organizations, by and large, have also encouraged a renaming, like in Switzerland, so that they now refer to disorders of sexual development. And there was a lot of controversy about that, but their reasoning was that with that nomenclature, they actually were able to get physicians to listen to them. Whereas before, if they used the term intersexuality, physicians they couldn't compute it. And they reasoned furthermore that the language then became parallel to the language of any developmental system. So you talk about disorders of cardiac development, and you talk about ways of treating it, which ones are life-threatening, which ones don't matter. So they wanted to, in a sense, normalize the unusual by giving it that name. And that has, in fact, made possible a much broader dialogue about what to do with infants who are born with disorders of sexual development. And what has happened is that certain of the national associations of medical specialists have made changes in what they call standards of practice. So, and the biggest changes have come from the pediatricians and these pediatric endocrinologists who now argue for a standard of practice that says that you do not automatically perform surgery on an infant, but only if the infant is in danger of losing his or her life, but that you, to the extent that's possible for the physical safety, you allow an infant to grow with whatever his or her difference is until such point that that it is possible for the child or young adult to make personal decisions, their own decisions about whether they want surgery, how they want to live, how they want to identify themselves. The virtue of this is that we don't understand very much about identity formation. So sometimes surgeons make mistakes and they remove something that later the child wants, like a testis. So they say, we know this child is going to develop a female gender identity. They remove the gonads, which might be testes, and then at age 4 or 5, the child says, I know I am a male. And then there's no quote, natural option left, and so if that child continues to maintain a male gender identity, then they have to give external hormone injections. The testis not only makes testosterone, it also makes estrogen, it makes a whole series of hormones that are important for normal male development. So by waiting until the identity of the child itself develops, then there are more good treatment options available. So that's the position taken now by the Association for Pediatric Endocrinology and the pediatricians. The surgeons, on the other hand, still want to operate quickly. And this is not surprising. I think in many countries, surgery as a discipline is a more conservative it's a more conservative discipline and slower to change. So the change is very uneven, and it depends on the physicians who are changing their minds, who are beginning to promote new practices. They train their residents, their students. Those students go out into other hospitals, begin to change practice. It's very slow, but there has been some change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, merci.
Oui, donc c'est à mon tour en tant que neurobiologiste de rendre hommage au travail pionnier d'Anne Fausto-Sterling, qui pour moi a été une révélation. Hein. Ces livres sont des livres cultes parce que elle m'a permis vraiment déjà de plus me sentir un petit peu seule. Quand on est neurobiologiste et qu'on a un avis un petit peu critique sur les activités de sa propre communauté, c'est-à-dire qu'on fait une critique de l'intérieur, on est dans une position qui n'est pas toujours très facile, pas facile par rapport à l'institution, par rapport aussi aux relations qu'on peut avoir avec ses collègues. Donc, savoir qu'on qu'on n'est pas seul, qu'il y a aussi dans d'autres domaines que la neurobiologie, bien sûr, des personnes qui font ce travail, et évidemment au niveau international. Donc ça, c'est extrêmement précieux pour continuer ce combat de critique interne. D'autre part, un point très important est justement que les biologistes qui travaillent sur ces questions puissent précisément s'associer avec les représentants et les spécialistes et les chercheurs des sciences humaines et sociales pour ensemble dialoguer, pour ensemble œuvrer à permettre déjà une information de qualité auprès d'un large public, avec aussi tout un effort de vulgarisation. Et il est important aussi de faire un travail de formation de nos collègues, les chercheurs, de leur apprendre qu'ils ont aussi une responsabilité par rapport à l'impact des conclusions que certains peuvent faire de leurs travaux. Et ce sont des notions qui évidemment relèvent d'une attitude qui relève de l'éthique. Si à l'heure actuelle nous avons intégré depuis juillet 2011 dans les lois de bioéthique, les neurosciences font maintenant partie des lois de neuroéthique, c'est pour une raison. La raison est qu'il y a une nécessité d'encadrer les pratiques en neurosciences, et le danger qui est derrière, bien sûr, c'est cette réification de la pensée, cette vision réductionniste de l'humain qui est réduit simplement à une machine cérébrale qui aurait simplement de temps en temps quelques réflexes hormonaux, et donc d'ignorer d'un revers de la main toutes les études qui ont fait l'histoire de l'humanité et toutes les autres disciplines qui se sont intéressées à l'histoire de la pensée et à l'histoire des hommes et des femmes. Donc, dans ce cadre-là, il y a une notion très importante parmi les études récentes qui ont été faites sur le cerveau. Cette notion est la notion de plasticité cérébrale qu'on a découverte depuis une quinzaine d'années. Et cette plasticité cérébrale est un argument majeur pour justement montrer à quel point les idées qui étaient celles de la construction sociale de nos identités ont un substrat biologique. Et un vrai substrat biologique, c'est-à-dire que maintenant on sait que à la naissance, seulement 10% des neurones sont connectés entre eux, et que l'immense majorité de nos milliards de connexions entre les neurones vont se faire après la naissance, en interaction avec l'environnement, et que cette interaction avec l'environnement est indispensable à la fabrication de la matière cérébrale. C'est absolument indispensable pour construire notre cerveau. Et donc c'est une notion fondamentale pour justement travailler avec nos collègues des sciences humaines et sociales, et surtout montrer que les idées qu'on avait auparavant, les idées d'un cerveau déjà fabriqué quasiment dès la naissance, déjà précablé, un cerveau dans lequel les hormones auraient déjà au stade fœtal induit une marque indélébile qui plus tard se réactiverait, mais néanmoins expliquerait nos itinéraires d'hommes et de femmes. Toutes ces notions-là d'il y a 50 ans ne sont plus tenables à l'heure actuelle par rapport à nos connaissances sur la plasticité cérébrale. Donc dans ce contexte-là, j'aurais voulu avoir le sentiment d'Anne Fausto-Sterling sur la réalité de la persistance de l'idéologie du déterminisme biologique, enfin du déterminisme neurobiologique en tout cas, face à nos connaissances sur la plasticité cérébrale, pour lesquelles on imaginerait que ces vieilles idées aient pu être quand même balayées depuis le temps. Elles sont toujours extrêmement présentes. et d'autre part qu'elle nous parle peut-être du contexte américain, à savoir qu'il existe des mouvements importants qui prônent des écoles séparées pour les garçons et les filles. Ce sont, je crois d'ailleurs, les mêmes mouvements qui prônent aussi l'enseignement du créationnisme par rapport au darwinisme. Enfin, le contexte américain, je pense, est très, très, très intéressant pour nous servir de contre-exemple. Merci.
So thank you for your comments and for that question. I think that we need to provide the public with a new language, and that's one of the difficulties. One of the reasons for the persistence of things like neurodeterminism is that we are trying to substitute something complicated for, we're trying to say development is complicated, development occurs over time, development has many inputs. We're trying to make that argument against a simple, easy, but false argument, which is, oh, there's a gene and that makes you behave a certain way. So you have a simple argument, or your brain is fixed, that's it. You can't change. So one of the things that I've really given a lot of thought to in recent years is trying to inject, especially when I talk to reporters, when I give general talks to the public, is to insist that we think developmentally, and to, when someone says to me, well, there's this study, someone says, well, I did a brain scan on men and women, I showed them an image, and in women one side of their brain lit up, and in men a different side lit up. And my response to that now is not so much to question the study itself, which probably could be done, but rather to say, okay, let me assume that that is an accurate finding. Then I have to ask you, so that's the start of your study. The important question is, how did the brains get to be that way? And so to always turn any conversation from any person, from a student, from a reporter, back to development, because only by discussing development can you begin to insist on this notion of neuroplasticity and the notion that the brain constructs itself always in response to input, both sensory, emotional, all the senses and emotions. So that has to be, I think, one very important task, is to keep trying to offer new language and to turn and to refuse the old terminology. So if someone says to me, a reporter most often, well, is homosexuality caused by genes or is it choice? Well, first of all, it's neither of those things. But the answer to that is not to try to answer it in those terms, but to say, I reject that framework. There's a better framework, which is to ask developmentally how we become sexual beings. How do we develop sexuality? And it's not homosexuality, it's how does any kind of sexuality develop? Because, in fact, we don't know very much about that. But clearly it has to be answered in terms of development. And the talk I'll give on Thursday gives some ideas about how we might answer it, especially if it were societally possible to study sexuality in children, which it's not. But if it were, you could then at least understand what a proper framework for answering that question might be. My experience is, in recent years, that if you talk to very au courant scientists, neurobiologists, who understand plasticity, they immediately understand what you're saying, that they totally agree. The brain is not predetermined. They don't have a deterministic argument to make. It's usually people in related fields. And here again, this is the utility of an idea in a related field. So the people who don't want to hear my argument are, say, people in psychology. I have the last two papers that I published. They were originally a long paper, now two papers, part 1 and part 2, about how to use something called dynamic systems theory to understand the emergence of gender differences. And as a takeoff on this book, I called it Sexing the Baby. I spent 4 years trying to get this work, because it's about human behavior, gender differences in children. I spent 4 years trying to get the work published in a psychology journal, and I failed. In the end, it was published in a journal called Social Science and Medicine, which is primarily a journal organized by sociologists. And the sociologists as a field, because they're more interested in social contributions to health, they understood what I was trying to do, and more importantly, were not resistant to it. So in the end, I could not breach that barrier from psychology in a direct way. I'm still trying to go around the wall and poke holes in it. I think I will succeed, but it was a very frustrating 4 years, I have to tell you. So I think that it's the fields like neuroscience, where people are very aware of neuroplasticity, are fields where people will understand the argument. But the minute you begin to get to fields which use neuroscience in a less knowledgeable way, then the resistance becomes very strong. So it's this cross-disciplinary problem as well.
Je vais juste faire une remarque et poser une question. Et d'abord, je voudrais justifier ma présence à la différence des 3 postfaciaires qui sont très compétentes. Je suis d'une incompétence complète, et c'est en fonction de ce critère que j'ai été choisi pour intervenir, pour illustrer le fait qu'il n'y a pas besoin d'être biologiste, qu'il n'y a pas besoin d'être paléoanthropologue, qu'il n'y a pas besoin d'être neurobiologiste, qu'il n'y a pas besoin d'être biologiste cellulaire pour trouver ce livre utile. Même les sociologues, et c'est vous dire, peuvent y trouver un grand bénéfice. Et alors, ma remarque, la première tient au statut même de la science. Le livre qui avait précédé Sexing the Body, un livre de 1985, c'était Les mythes du genre. Et en fait, il me semble que dans la critique de la science qui est proposée, il y a 2 possibilités tout à fait différentes, et qu'il est utile de penser les 2 à la fois. La première, c'est la démystification, c'est-à-dire montrer qu'il y a des biais, montrer qu'il y a des points aveugles liés au sexisme ordinaire de la science. Ça, c'est une première approche. Mais il y a une deuxième approche qui me paraît également, peut-être encore plus importante dans le champ scientifique, et qui est explicitée dans la préface qu'a donnée pour l'édition française Anne Fausto-Sterling, c'est l'inscription dans un champ nouveau qui s'est développé depuis quelques dizaines d'années, avec des gens comme Sandra Harding ou comme Donna Haraway, c'est-à-dire du côté d'un savoir situé. Autrement dit, la question n'est pas seulement de dire qu'il y a la fausse science et qu'on va corriger les biais, mais qu'en fait, la question du biais n'est pas forcément la bonne manière de poser les choses, et qu'il y a des points de vue situés, et que donc ce ne sont pas seulement nos adversaires qui ont des points de vue, mais nous aussi. Et de ce point de vue-là, ça change la manière dont on se représente les études féministes en général. C'est-à-dire qu'au lieu d'avoir à s'excuser constamment d'avoir un point de vue politique, on est en position de dire c'est comme ça que fonctionne la science. Elle ne parle pas en dehors du monde, elle est dans le monde avec un point de vue situé. Donc ça me paraît un enjeu important pour l'ensemble des personnes qui essaient de développer un travail dans le champ scientifique sans renoncer pour autant à un engagement, et en particulier à un engagement féministe. Ça, c'était la remarque. Ma question porte sur l'actualité, ou du moins est liée à l'actualité. En France, ces questions, donc, je le disais très rapidement tout à l'heure, sont très présentes depuis quelque temps. Si vous prenez la manifestation qui avait lieu, on voyait, il y a quelques semaines, contre l'ouverture du mariage, on voyait une bannière qui disait « Mariage pour tous égale théorie du gender pour tous ». Et donc on voit bien, ça faisait écho à des discussions qui avaient lieu encore il y a 1 ou 2 ans sur l'importation de la théorie du gender. Or là, on voit bien que ce n'est pas une théorie du gender, c'est un champ d'études où s'affrontent des conceptions différentes de ce que c'est que le sexe, de ce que c'est que le genre, et à l'intérieur même des études féministes, il y a une histoire de l'évolution de ces conceptualisations. Mais ma question porte sur l'articulation entre genre et sexe d'un côté et sexualité de l'autre. Parce que les adversaires de, entre guillemets, avec 3 guillemets si vous voulez, les adversaires de la théorie du gender disent, au fond, genre et sexualité, c'est la même chose. Vous introduisez la catégorie de genre et ça finira par le mariage homosexuel. Tout ça, c'est la même chose. Il me semble, enfin, la collection qu'avec Elsa Dorlin nous animons s'appelle Genre et sexualité, avec comme idée qu'il faut réfléchir constamment à la manière dont les 2 termes s'articulent. Je serais intéressé de savoir comment Anne Fausto-Sterling reformulerait cette articulation entre genre et sexualité pour à la fois penser le lien entre les deux, mais en même temps ne pas reprendre à son compte la vision de la droite religieuse transatlantique qui dit au fond tout ça c'est pareil.
Thank you, Eric, for that difficult question. I would say, first of all, that this is something I'm still giving a lot of thought to, because it's clear to me that at least in U.S. culture, both in gay communities, but also in the general culture, on television shows and things like that, comedies, that gender and sexuality are often seen at least to overlap, that there seem to be a connection between them. And I think that it's not true just of people outside of gay culture, but of men and women within their respective gay cultures. So historically, there's been a great deal of gendered play, I would say, within the gay community, both in terms of physical manifestations, physical choices, choices about dress, clothing, choices about pronouns. So a choice to call your boyfriend girl or your girlfriend your husband, but that's a kind of internal within group play. So clearly gender play is part of the story of sexuality, but at least within the gay community it's often a very conscious play. But outside the gay community, I think that there is often a confusion or a sense that there might be some kind of identity between, say, femininity and homosexuality in a man, or masculinity and homosexuality in a woman. And that was, I think, more true, say, in the 1950s than it is now, because much wider ranges of male and female gender roles are possible now and are seen now, both among heterosexual as well as homosexual people. So you have, on the one hand, the notion of gender is changing for everyone. So in the United States, most women work outside the home. There isn't an equal sharing of household duties, but there's some sharing where there was none. There are males who are employed as nurses, which was an all-female work job in the 1950s. So there's gender itself for all people is in play. So within that, then, sexuality and its link to gender is also in play. But I think that theoretically, maybe going back to certain basic ideas can help understand what the connections might be. So I think, first of all, we can invoke a concept that's been around in psychology for a long time, and that's a concept called gender identity. And that's a basic sense of self as either being male or female. That's a concept, that's a sense that usually develops in a child by the time they're about 3 years old. And it becomes more fixed and more linked to anatomy by the time a child is 5 or 7. But that is not about desire. That's about understanding where one is placed in culture with regard to one's physical body, and then linking it to social roles that are presented to the child. Now, the question of desire, what kinds of things become erotically attractive, is in a way a separate question, but it obviously gets linked to gender identity in certain ways. How? I have no idea. But I think that one can ask a somewhat separate question, which is, how does erotic desire come into being for anybody? How does it? So, and how does it? And this, and you can start to subdivide it, so it isn't only, oh, I'm a man and I'm attracted to men, or I'm attracted to women. But of course, we know there's all sorts of subdivisions of erotic desire. Some people prefer certain body types. They may prefer a woman with very well-developed breasts over a woman with small breasts, for example. That may be a particular form of desire. It could be, of heterosexual desire. So you have subdivisions within these big categories, so we need to understand how desire develops and how it becomes eroticized for any person. And that's, again, it's a developmental question. It's not something that happens. You don't have adult eroticism in a 4-year-old, but you have some kind of eroticism in a 4-year-old. It's a 4-year-old eroticism. And how does that become translated over years into adult sexual behavior or adult sexual interest? We don't understand that particularly well, or really at all. But that question is somewhat independent of gender identity. So I think providing a more complex framework, theoretical framework, could help us understand how sometimes sexual desire, sexual preference is linked to a notion of gender identity, and how sometimes it's not. And then if you go back to that model I had of the orthogonal model of being able to be both masculine and feminine at the same time, you can begin to think about how if you layered or incorporated the notion of desire into that, you might have developmental situations which evoked both a masculine sense of self, but also a same-sex desire. So then gender would not be linked to same-sex desire, but other cases in which there's a man who has a very feminine sense of self. I also think that we have to really begin to study life cycles. There's one really good longitudinal study done in the United States by a psychologist named Lisa Diamond. And so far she has 10 years of study. She started interviewing 100 lesbians when they were about 18 years of age. And she re-interviews them every 2 years. And she now has a decade of study. And what she has found is that their self-conception, their relationship to their notion of gender, their identity as lesbian or not, changes enormously from time to time, from interview to interview. She is applying also this notion of dynamic systems, the notion of context, to this life cycle story of female sexuality. And she intends to continue this study. I don't know how she does it, but I joked with her at one point that she it was as if she were married to these 100 women, because she has to keep in touch with them and have intimate conversations with them every 2 years. And so far, she's done this, and I think she will keep track of that cohort for as long as she can. But we need more studies like that take people over a life cycle and really study the relationships between gender, sex, sexuality in that long-term context to begin to understand, to be able to answer your question.